everyone, good afternoon. First, let me present myself. I am Iqra, researcher at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. Today we are having a great personality, Professor Martin Jones. Professor Martin Jones is a senior lecturer in international human rights law at the Center for Applied Human Rights and the York Law School of the University of York in United Kingdom, where he co-convenes postgraduate training on international human rights and refugee legal advocacy. After practicing as a human rights and refugee lawyer in Canada, he transitioned to his current academic career. Martin has been involved in developing and leading legal aid programs for refugees in the Middle East and Asia, most notably by co-founding the largest provider of legal services to refugees in Egypt and various regional and international coalitions of refugee legal aid organizations. Martin has also been involved in research and advocacy around the protection of human rights defenders and has worked with the range of protection actors to develop both legal guidelines on the rights of human rights defenders and approaches that support the well-being of defenders working in difficult environments. Martin has served as an expert advisor to a range of governments and agencies, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Martin Jones. How are you, sir?
Wonderful. Nice to talk to you, Iqra.
Okay, let me start. My first question. As your research focuses on the situation of human rights defenders as well as refugee law, first and foremost, I would like to hear about your experiences.
Well, I began my career actually as a refugee lawyer, so really rooted in the individual case, as any lawyer is. I did a little bit of human rights law too, but I worked in Canada for a number of years representing refugee claimants from a range of countries, including South Asia, in the Canadian asylum system. And over time, I think that wore me down a bit. It's a difficult process for claimants and also for the lawyers that accompany them. And I kind of transitioned to my current kind of academic career, where thankfully I have a bit more time to look more at some of the systems. So obviously less involved in individual cases and more involved, as you were saying in your introduction, looking at systems of protection. So helping legal aid providers develop programs of support, helping governments or international agencies develop policies that better support both refugees as well as human rights defenders. And often those are the same people, right? I mean, often, human rights defenders who, we would commonly refer to as kind of activists, end up having to become refugees because of their activism. That is exactly what prompts them having to leave. And so actually, I find the work that I do both on human rights defenders and refugees reinforces each other.
I really appreciate your experiences, Professor Martin. Moving to another question. Human rights are the rights established by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the other human rights instruments. How can you explain human rights from a legal and sociological standpoint based on the current situation?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and the question kind of suggests what I think we all experience in the world today, which is that we're all aware of a range of places and circumstances in which human rights aren't very well respected, and yet on the other hand, we have this paradox whereby it is a very heavily legally regulated field. I suppose my starting point for human rights, though, isn't the international conventions. That's one way of thinking about it. And in that case, the question is, well, why hasn't the ambition of the global treaty making process, ranging from, resolutions at the UN, like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, to some of the treaties that you mentioned, why hasn't that trickled down? But my starting point generally for human rights actually is with an idea that's embedded at its very core, which is this idea of dignity, kind of a sense of dignity that is particular to human beings and that should be enjoyed by every human being. And where that belief and construct of dignity comes from, I think, is a long and probably complicated conversation. But if we begin there, I think we can see that human rights and even human rights law doesn't necessarily come from places like Geneva or New York or wherever these resolutions and treaties are negotiated, but rather it comes from the societies in which we live. I mean, there's ways in which every community recognizes that fundamental dignity. Now, it's an incomplete recognition. We all live within communities that spurn particular types of peoples and make taboos when there really shouldn't be taboos, but this idea that we kind of have to respect each other, that there's something fundamentally dignified about how each of us should want to live our lives, I mean, which is rolled up into kind of ideas of justice as well, I think is on kind of a daily level in a very local way, familiar to us. And so I mean, it changes the question a bit. So it's no longer, well, why doesn't international law trickle down into our communities? The question is, within our communities, what's stopping kind of the growing of this grassroots idea of dignity? What's stopping it from coming into flower in our communities? And what that I think does is it makes us recognize, and this goes to the sociological kind of aspect of your question, what it makes us realize that actually there are some things that are very local to us about how we run our communities, how we speak to each other, how we organize our families that are problematic, that are often deeply problematic. And it puts the responsibility more upon us as local citizens of whatever communities we're part of to try and fix those things locally. That is a big ask, but it gives us agency, in a way that sometimes a problem in New York or a problem in Geneva doesn't give us much agency. I mean, few of us have ever visited or spent much time in those places, whereas I think understanding it as a local problem about stopping the local understandings of dignity from coming into flower, from growing up from the grassroots, I think gives us a little bit more control over how we might chart a better future for our communities.
You are absolutely right. I totally agree with you. Moving to the another question, how do you believe human rights defenders seek to promote and protect civil and political rights, as well as to promote, protect, and realize economic, social, and cultural rights?
I think one of the most interesting things over the last 20 or so years has been kind of the awakening of the world, I should say. I mean, I was going to say the international community, but I think all of us, to the role that activists play. I mean, I think there have been activists around since the beginning of time, right? People trying to change things and make the world a better place, I think goes back to the origins of human society in a number of different ways. But I think over the last couple of decades, since the turn of the millennium, I think there's been an increasing willingness to acknowledge that role. So suddenly we've begun to notice that there are these people called activists that we now label as human rights defenders. At an international level, I think that began obviously in 1998 with the General Assembly's passage of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which, interestingly marked the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration also. It's kind of this belated realization that, well, we can have all these aspirations that are famously set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but how are we going to get it done? And I think back in 1948, I mean, certainly members of the committee that drafted it recognized this. Eleanor Roosevelt has spoken eloquently about this. But the international community wasn't quite ready to explain how those aspirations in the Universal Declaration were actually going to come into reality. And by 1998, I think they'd kind of become willing to recognize that actually the solution to realizing human rights, or at least a big part of the solution, is empowering local individuals, these human rights defenders. And so they work in local communities. They are, by definition, local actors, and they campaign. They campaign for the rights of their family members, sometimes the rights of themselves. Sometimes they're from disadvantaged or marginalized communities, and they conduct a range of different types of advocacy. As a lawyer, obviously, the types of advocacy I am actually most interested in is the advocacy they use, where they use legal norms, local legal norms or international norms, and places where they use courts doing litigation or strategic litigation to try and advance their interests in their cases. But that's just one dimension. I mean, there's social advocacy and political advocacy as well, that defenders are using, depending upon their circumstances.
Agreed, Professor Martin, and it was really amazed how to share a previous background. Moving to the another question, as a senior lecturer in international human rights law, Professor Martin, how do you think human rights law apply to minority right laws in various countries where religious minorities are oppressed?
Yeah. I guess it's exactly to minorities, particularly in places where they're oppressed. I mean, more generally, it's to oppressed people that I think human rights law is most important, right? I mean, the powerful generally don't need the protection of human rights law. Human rights law wouldn't really be doing its work if it was not trying to protect, trying to remind us of our obligations to the least powerful. So that's particularly why we have international covenants for, not just against racial discrimination to deal with this issue of racial minorities, but also to protect children, to protect migrant workers and so on, including refugees and whatnot. I mean, these are all groups that are in various kinds of ways because of their age or their political status, lack of citizenship, or their differences. They find it difficult to have their voice heard in most of our political communities. So I think it's exactly, I mean, for religious and racial minorities, included in South Asia, but I mean, other places, it's human rights law really has to play a role. I mean, it certainly sets out norms. The norms of international human rights law, I mean, for better and worse, have largely been adopted by most of the countries in South Asia. I mean, the rate of accession to some of the key instruments is pretty high. Some of the constitutions, I mean, similarly proclaim the same kind of values. I think the real challenge in the region, as with in other regions, is how do we take those norms, those legal standards, and how do we ensure that they are actually realized? And that is the question that we opened our discussion with of how can we have all of these frameworks of rules that are actually fairly clear and well developed, and yet have these gaps. And I think at least part of the answer is that it's often very difficult to enforce these rules, and the enforcement of the rules comes at great personal cost. I've been involved, for example, to take one of the issues that I've been involved in the region in from a distance supporting the litigation around the Rohingya in India. And that litigation was pursued with hesitancy by the Rohingya community and by lawyers as well, because there's been a backlash, as you know. I mean, not just because of the litigation, but generally against this new minority group within India's borders, but also elsewhere in the region. And the individuals involved in the case make themselves even more vulnerable by complaining about their rights violations. And so I think one of the things that we have to do isn't just think about new strategies in the region to advance the rights, but also think about ways that we can make that task easier for the people who have to do it. How can we make it easier and reduce the chance of backlash for people who are involved in litigation, for example? What kind of standards can we get the Indian government to adopt? What kind of norms can we get in the Indian legal community to understand? To make this easier for the next litigants who have to take on these kind of cases.
Right. I value and respect your opinion. Professor Martin, my next question is hate speech. As you know, hate speech have become widespread in South Asia with significant consequences for religious, ethnic, linguistic, and gender minorities. Large regional organizations have long openly used hate speech, often from senior leaders, to propagate and reinforce stereotypes and prejudices against minority groups. New options powered by digital technology, especially television and social media platforms, have been used successfully for this purpose. What techniques, tools, and strategies are available to meet this challenge, especially in the solution space?
Yeah, I mean, this is the double-edged sword of technology, right? It brings us all together and gives us powerful new ways to reach larger numbers of people. But that interconnectivity that it creates and allows, that it fosters, isn't always used for a good purpose. I'm not sure this is a new problem. I mean, I was... I remember hearing of the Rwandan genocide, which isn't that long ago, but I mean, goes back now 30 years or so. And technology fostered that genocide, right? In that case, it wasn't, social media, it wasn't Facebook, it was the radio. I mean, the problem of technology connecting us, but also separating us, I think, goes back to the rise of Nazism in the 30s in Europe, and probably even further, with the ways of the new printing press was probably used when it was invented. So I think it's always a challenge, and I think part of the problem is that the laws have taken a while to catch up. And particularly when we're talking about social media platforms, I think for the longest time, the law has understood these platforms to be neutral. And because of that, to be removed from any kind of responsibility. And so we've seen the rise of platforms and, including very powerful, transnationally organized platforms like Facebook or Twitter, the rise of them without any increase in the level of responsibility. And so, they have been immunized through various acts of legislation in different countries from liability, for example, from defamation. You can, if I were to say something wrong, if I were to lie about you in a newspaper, I could sue the news, or somebody could sue the newspaper, right? And the author of the article. But if I were to lie on Facebook, I'm the only defendant. Facebook is immune from defamation in many countries. So I think there's ways in which the law has given probably a bit too much free rein to some of they're only belatedly catching up to their responsibilities. Having said that, I mean, I think hate speech is a really interesting issue for human rights practitioners, because clearly one of the core values and one of the core freedoms that we have as human beings within human rights law that's recognized is also the freedom of expression. And so, trying to figure out where freedom of expression ends and where hate speech begins, I think has always been quite a difficult task. Now, I'm not denying that I think there's some very clear, as you pointed out, some very clear examples of hate speech that aren't close to that line. But as a human rights lawyer, I think there are some other examples that are much closer to the line where we have to think about what are the implications going to be? Because as you know, freedom of expression and also hate speech, and for that matter, defamation rules are very often used against the minorities, right? When the minority complains about the government, when the minority says something, in response to the hate speech, then often they are sued. Often they are charged with, criminal defamation. Often they are closed down, their printing licenses removed, depending upon the country. I mean, these laws that we want enforced against the people who are speaking hate are actually often the laws that are used against us in our defense. And so I think we need to step back a bit and ask questions about whether the law is really the appropriate solution, and if so, what's going wrong with how it's being used. I don't have an easy answer. I mean, I think if anyone had an easy answer for this question, it wouldn't be as big a problem as it is.
You are right. It might work. Okay. I read in one of your articles that the refugee regime can provide a meaningful remedy to human rights defenders in danger. What are your thoughts on why the governments of South Asian countries are not putting forward this solution?
Well, I think there's two pretty easy answers to that. The first is that the governments of the region generally aren't supportive of human rights defenders. And the second is that they're not much more supportive of refugees. So we have a region in South Asia where almost all of the states are not party to the Refugee Convention, and which many of the states have actively resisted the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, and have not spoken about human rights defenders in a supportive way in international fora, at least, and I think equally domestically. If you think about how government actors in the region speak about protesters, about the farmers protesting, about other groups in other countries protesting, you don't see positive remarks. And so, I mean, I think, understanding human rights defenders who have to go into exile as refugees, I think gives them, in many places, the possibility for building a future in the way that a refugee can, and has support from the international community. And that's very imperfect and incomplete, but it gives them a new pathway. I think the reality is that it's probably and exile outside the region for defenders if they want that to be meaningful, because within the region being a refugee is quite a difficult task because of the lack of explicit protection and commitment to refugee protection by states in the region. There's exceptions depending upon, in India, for example, depending upon whether you can identify yourself as one of the historic non-religious minority communities elsewhere, and use some of India's new legislation as a pathway to protection within India, and equally in some of the other countries of the region. There's other ways if you find yourself in a particularly politically favored group, but by and large, both being an activist and being a refugee in the region is a very difficult status to have. And so, while I think understanding human rights offenders in exile as refugees, I think, can be helpful, I think the reality is that it's probably more helpful in regions that have made bigger commitments to both human rights offenders and refugees.
Great. I really appreciate your thoughts, Professor Martin. My next question is, one of humanity's oldest tradition is to provide protection to those fleeing in search of safety. What legislation does UNHCR have in place to protect refugees?
I mean, UNHCR is the UN's biggest operational agency. I mean, we talk a lot over the last year and a half about the World Health Organization, and it's a pretty big agency from the UN as well. But in terms of the numbers of staff and field operations, UNHCR dwarfs any of its competitors within the UN system. So UNHCR has a lot of activities. I mean, what governs UNHCR is its statute that dates back to when it was created by a resolution of the General Assembly in 1950, and that has been periodically renewed since then by the General Assembly. UNHCR is also the supervisor, in a sense, of the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Convention rating the status of refugees, as well as the 1967 Protocol rating the status of refugees, that kind of together provide a bit of the normative architecture for refugee protection around the world. So that's really kind of where UNHCR comes from in terms of what laws does it use. But, unfortunately, in South Asia, as I said earlier, none of the major hosts of refugees have become party to the Refugee Convention, right? And so kind of UNHCR's biggest legal instrument, at least at the international level, doesn't have the same force it might have elsewhere. UNHCR also draws upon customary international law. I mean, we often get fixated by things that we write down. As international lawyers, we know that international law isn't just the things we write down in the forms of treaties, but also the customs that states perform. And so obviously there are norms around refugee protection that would attach even to states that haven't signed the treaties. Norms like the prohibition on refoulement, the prohibition on sending refugees back to places of danger, that would attach to states like India or Bangladesh, and that prohibit them from doing certain things to refugees. And so UNHCR draws also upon those norms to advocate to the governments in the region not to violate them, with varying levels of success, I must say.
My next question is, international refugee law is a regime of protection linked to a defined status with specific guarantees. What is the connection between the legal arguments and the international refugee regime?
I mean, I think there's two parts to my answer for this question. The first is that I think the ways that refugee law sets out the rights of refugees still leaves a lot of room for legal argument. And then secondly, there's often a lot of legal argument around who actually is a refugee. So in relation to the first point, the Refugee Convention is a peculiar international treaty in that it doesn't really follow the structure of how it gives rights that was really adopted in subsequent treaties. We have to remember that it was one of the first international human rights treaties that the UN negotiated. And so it often gives rights, not absolutely like subsequent human rights treaties, but only relatively. Not even to all refugees, but to particular types of refugees. And so there's a lot of legal work in unpacking exactly what a particular type of refugee in a particular place actually enjoys. That requires really understanding the context and what rights are given out to various comparator populations and what exactly is the status of the particular refugee. So no two refugees, even in the same place under the Refugee Convention, may actually enjoy the same rights. The second thing to say is that exactly who is a refugee is on the one hand, kind of we like to think fairly intuitive, but on the other hand, it's actually quite legally complicated. I mean, we toss around the word refugee an awful lot in the media, for example, when we describe events of forced displacement, whether it be by natural disaster or war or revolution. But who a refugee is under the Refugee Convention has a very particular meaning. You know, a refugee is required to have a well-founded fear of persecution, for example, as one of the requirements. Well, what does that mean? What makes a fear well-founded? What is a qualifying fear? What exactly do we mean by persecution? I mean, all of these are answers or questions that have very lengthy answers that have been developed in case law and in guidance by UNHCR over about the last 70 years since the treaty was negotiated. And so there is often a big part of the debate about what the answer is to the first question is actually a debate over the answer to the second question. So the debate over what rights refugees get is actually often a debate over whether somebody is a refugee or not. And so, you know, UNHCR has developed processes, and many states have developed processes of so-called refugee status determination, whereby the arguments for and against somebody being a refugee are weighed very carefully, ideally by people with a lot of experience and drawing upon a lot of other reliable evidence. But you know, often when we're debating refugee protection, we're debating these two things, and sometimes it gets a bit blurry about exactly whether it's what rights a refugee gets that we're talking about, or whether somebody is or is not a refugee.
I fully agree with you, Professor Martin. What else, in your opinion, can the international community and UNHCR do to protect South Asia's persecuted minorities? What are your thoughts on how the most pressing issues affecting the South Asian minorities should be addressed in the coming days?
I mean, UNHCR's mandate is to protect, I mean, not just refugees, but internally displaced persons in particular cases. So, you know, when you think about persecuted minorities within the region, they fall into both those categories, you know. I mean, what UNHCR should do, I guess, what UNHCR can do is often quite limited. It's often limited, amongst other things, by the amount of resources that UNHCR has. And, you know, while I said earlier that UNHCR is the UN's biggest operational agency, it is also funded almost entirely by voluntary contributions. And so it is very much at the whim of both the global economy, which, as we know now, is a bit in a bit of a shambles, but also global political will. And is often dictated by states that give it money exactly what it should be doing with it. So its freedom to pick and choose what it's doing is often quite limited, and we have to recognize that. So I would broaden the question and ask, well, what can we do? And I guess the first thing that we can do is, you know, beyond reforming our laws and introducing better processes and opening our borders, which are unrealistic in the short term, if I'm being honest. I think there are norms and laws and processes that we can draw upon that can greatly assist both refugees and non-displaced minority communities as well. I mean, there are laws in all of the countries in the region that guarantee women, for example, various protections against various kinds of gender-based violence. Why is it that minority communities aren't being able to access these protections? You know, that doesn't require a reform in the law. That requires a reform in the way our agencies operate, the way our police operate, the way our NGOs operate, the way our barefoot legal advocates operate. And so there's work that we can do. And this goes back to what I said at the start, I think at a very local level, in terms of connecting up the legal frameworks with kind of, in a way, the victims, so that we can get put those legal frameworks that already exist and those policies that already exist to work. So, you know, there's organizations in India that I've worked with, that I am working with, on projects to not only improve access of local women to remedies when they suffer violence, but also to take that framework and that infrastructure and begin to extend it to the refugee women who live in the same communities, you know, or neighboring communities even sometimes. And so I would think about this less as a task for UNHCR, although, as I said, it has a few options there in terms of law reform and introducing processes and changing border management and its advocacy on that. And I would again try and think, well, what can we do? And I think what we can do is much more local, but is also much more hopeful. And it won't necessarily solve the problem for the millions of people that you're speaking about, but it can solve problems for dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people in the local communities that we live.
Yes, Professor Martin, your remarks are much appreciated. And you give a huge knowledge. My next question is, as the refugee dilemma and crisis have gradually increased around the world, is it also due to the failure of basic human rights laws to be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, somebody doesn't become a refugee generally unless their human rights are violated. I mean, there are probably some exceptions we can think about, but as a general principle, I mean, the reason people become refugees is either because their rights have already been violated or are about to be violated. You know, those people right now fleeing Afghanistan, have either already previously or currently suffered under the new government, the Taliban. Or are very worried because of the Taliban's past behavior about what will happen to them in the future. I mean, they're worried about very serious human rights violations in the future, and that's causing them to leave. Now, again, there's probably a few exceptions, but I think, the overwhelming majority, almost all refugees in the world fall into that category. So us, we talk about durable solutions in the refugee world, and we think about how refugees solve their problems. The best and biggest historically durable solution is always going home. And nobody's going to go home after they fled home unless the problem that they fled has been fixed. And so human rights and fixing the human rights violations is, I think, ultimately the durable solution to the refugee crisis. Now, it's interesting that we think about it as a crisis. And, UNHCR will certainly say in its appeals for funding that there are more refugees in the world today than there have ever been since the Second World War. The only thing that I would say to that is there have been moments with a lot of refugees before. I mean, and certainly there have been moments with a lot of displaced people. I mean, think about in South Asia. I mean, humankind's biggest moment of displacement was the partition of South Asia, right? Now, we can argue for a while about whether those were refugees within the sense of the 1951 convention or not, but they were certainly displaced. There were millions of displaced persons having to move very long distances at great personal cost. I mean, there were deaths, and so I mean, I think sometimes the language of crisis can make us forget. Make us think that the current moment is particularly unique. And I'm not trying to minimize the moment that we're in and minimize the suffering of the millions of refugees there are. But there have been moments in the past where there have been millions of refugees. And I think it will help us figure out what the solutions are to the current moment if we were a little bit more aware of where we've come from. How was it that the displacement was addressed in 1948? How was it that it was addressed at other moments? And no historical analogy is ever going to be perfect, and we're not going to be able to copy and paste solutions. But sometimes I think the language of crisis and kind of the focus on the unusualness of this current moment belies the fact that actually this is a bigger problem that has a much deeper history. And so it's kind of going back to that comment about human rights. I mean, yes, at the end of the day, there's a kind of, we could get fixated upon, as I said earlier, kind of the coming into power of the Taliban in Afghanistan. But if the bigger problem is that many governments around the world, new and old, don't respect human rights, then maybe instead of treating the Taliban as the crisis, we should actually treat human rights violations as a crisis and figure out what the bigger and deeper response should be to that crisis.
Very well explained answer, Professor Martin. Moving to another question, what major refugee crises have been developing in South Asian regional scenario as a result of new changing global dynamics, and how is your organization dealing with the new challenges in the context of legal aid and refugee assistance?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think we always have to be aware that, notwithstanding the argument I just made about kind of our continuity with our past, that things change. For me, I mean, and we could talk at length about environmental displacement. I think that is much less of a new phenomena. I think there is both within countries in the region in terms of internal displacement because of large mega development projects, as well as kind of catastrophic extreme weather events. I think the region has a much longer history of displacement than we recognize. It's catchy to talk about it as climate change, but hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced every year in the region because of these kind of events for a long, long time. So, I mean, but rather than talk about that, I mean, I guess for me, part of, if not what is new, but what we need to increasingly recognize is that the solution for the region isn't necessarily to be found in other regions. So I think for a long time, and this maybe belies a bit of my personal background, the solution for South Asia has been, well, let's take a look and see what works elsewhere and copy that and adopt it here. And to take refugee law, for example, let's try and convince all of the states in the region to adopt the Refugee Convention. And that seems to have worked a little bit in places like Europe and North America and Australasia. Let's try and apply that here. For me, what the current moment and what the trends suggest in the region is that's not applicable. There's a nativism, a desire to recognize the particular histories and beliefs of the local community that is prominent in South Asia as well as in many other parts of the world. And one of the ways that we need to adapt to that is by reframing our solutions less in terms of global solutions and importing the solutions from elsewhere, and more in finding what are the historic solutions that have been practiced locally. I mean, to give one example that is slightly outside the region, I've been doing a lot of work recently in the province of Aceh in Indonesia. And the fishermen there, unusually for the region, as well as probably more generally, have been bringing ashore boatloads of refugees, Rohingya refugees. And, it's thousands of refugees. And so in that sense, it's a significant number. But, in light of the more than 1 million Rohingya that are displaced, it's still small numbers. But I've been fascinated by how they've explained their reaction. Because, the easier response is I was at sea and I saw people and I'm a human being, and so I'm going to bring them ashore. And that's particularly part of what they say. And it's part of what anybody who rescues somebody, I think, from a perilous situation says. I didn't have a choice. It was just my sense of humanity. But when you probed and you asked them deeper questions about, well, why did you feel this particular way? They make reference to their longstanding traditions. As you said, I think every community has, long histories of sanctuary. They may define them in particular kinds of ways, but they often go back to some of the founding texts of our religious faiths, our early practices as communities. They may be how we define ourselves. Our community may define itself as being a refugee community that fled hundreds of years ago from a particular place. And so the Acehnese say, well, actually, we're part of a long history of fishermen who rescue people. And in fact, it's such a long history that we recognize it in our local customs and practices, and it's part of our local legal tradition. And so, I think one of the ways forward in abandoning trying to import these international legal standards from afar is excavating local beliefs and practices and finding these examples from within the region that draw upon very deeply entrenched local norms. In the case of the Acehnese fishermen, they cite effectively legal obligations that date back hundreds of years to the great Sultanate of Aceh, which was, at the time before the Dutch colonized the region, the dominant regional power. And, that is an example from slightly outside the region, but within the region, I think that's our task, is to respond to the nativism and to push back and to say, well, we can't just think about ourselves and our values, and to try and continue to make connections globally, sure. But it's also to say the task that we're asking you to do isn't actually a foreign task, is actually a task, as you say, that is embedded in our deepest traditions, and to excavate that and to build our support that way. I do work in East Asia, which again, is outside South Asia, but, I do work in Hong Kong. And the thing that you have to say to locals in Hong Kong, and, it doesn't always get well received, is that the vast majority of the population of Hong Kong are refugees, that more than 85% of the population trace themselves back to the influx during the Communist Revolution. that they were displaced in that case from mainland China. And again, as with the Indian partition, we can argue about does that make them refugees or not. Certainly at the time, it probably would have. And drawing upon that kind of both experience as well as the legal standards and frameworks that come with that experience, I think has to be part of our path forward at the current moment.
You really set a high bar with your organization, Professor Martin. My next question is there any special legal aid or assistance provided to minorities among the refugees? There
should be, is the short answer. Often there isn't. And we can think about minority communities in a number of different ways. I mean, as I said earlier, some of them are just a big part of the refugee flows generally, right? If you think about the Rohingya, who flee to the region, they are now a big percentage of almost all of the refugees in places like Bangladesh, but even in places further afield like India. A growing percentage of refugees are this religious minority from Myanmar, and new religious minority in India, obviously. So mainstream legal aid programs often respond to displacement of minority communities just generally because they're refugees. I think the interesting part of the question, though, is, well, what about the minorities within the minorities? So what about, for example, individuals from LGBTQ plus communities, who have a different gender identity or sexual orientation within a community, within a refugee flow? How do legal aid programs recognize not only the particular needs of the minority community, but also the inevitable minorities within that minority? And I think on that, legal aid providers have probably been, as with all of us, learning, and probably need to do more. There are, it is very easy when you're providing services and forced to provide services to very large numbers of people to focus upon the general and not the particular. And I think part of the recognition of the experience of minority communities, as well as the minorities within those communities, is that glosses over the particular needs of individuals. And legal aid communities have, and providers have, the same prejudices as the rest of us. There's a blindness to particular types of minorities that all of us have because of our upbringing and the cultures within which we're situated. And so I think there needs to continue to be work done by civil society, by legal aid communities in making sure that we're reaching out not just to refugees generally who might be from minority communities, but also the particular elements of the communities that are harder to reach and that are marginalized even within these marginalized communities.
All right, Professor Martin, in the global context where mutual support is essential to amplify the voices of minorities, how can the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities and you collaborate to benefit the region's minorities?
Yeah, it's a human rights movement. It's a refugee rights movement, and movement for me suggests not just individual people doing things, but groups of people doing things together. And I think that is the most powerful way of getting things accomplished. I think part of that is communicating. It's wonderful to have this dialogue and continuing these kind of dialogues where we can really hear what people are thinking and what people are doing. So I think continuing these kinds of conversations is a great idea. Networks equally, letting each other know on a regular basis what different actors are doing within the region, so that, even if we're not actively coordinating, we're understanding, what each other are doing and what the plans are. As with SARIM, I'm at a research organization. I think one of the things that we can contribute together is research that tries to address both gaps in knowledge about minorities, for example, in the region, as well as misunderstandings. I think research is great at doing both of those things, and research institutes in particular often have a standing, a credibility in the public and in the media eye that kind of individual advocacy organizations don't, right? When minority communities try and point out the misunderstandings of the majority about them, they're often kind of disregarded as either dishonest or misrepresenting or at the very least self-interested. I think researchers get a better opportunity to say, no, I've done a study and this actually isn't true. What you thought about this minority community isn't actually true. And so I think that it puts it on us to make sure that the research we do tries to reveal this, and that we put extra effort into to letting that research be known, because, as you know, the best research in the world can get published, in an academic journal, for example, in a good academic journal, and still be only read by a dozen people. So I think a big part of it is talking to each other and trying to get word out to other people beyond the movement, right? The movement, in order to be successful, has to be a growing movement. And so I'm happy to continue the dialogue, and I'm happy to collaborate on the research that we do together going forward, because of our shared interest in this issue.
Thank you, Professor Martin. We look forward for future collaboration. As a professor, what is the most significant piece of advice you can give to incoming academics or new practitioners?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I suppose the answer to this question in particular changes depending upon the particular year or moment that I am at in academia. Here in the UK, we have just finished a cycle of evaluations of our academic institutions that has been a bit exhausting, but it has also, for me, revealed kind of some of the strengths and weaknesses of for example, the place that I work at, as well as the work that I do. And it's made me realize that often when we begin a new career, whether it is as an academic, a new researcher, or as a practitioner, me as a young lawyer, that we get told what it means to be successful. Part of it is we look around and we see who's gotten rewarded. Who are the senior lawyers? Who are the senior academics? And I think it's very easy to then begin to plan our careers based upon the metrics of success that we see represented in front of us. Yeah. So in the case of academics, to say, well, okay, I see that there's professors and I'm not a professor, I want to become one. And so therefore, the professors all seem to have more publications and they've all written a book. So that's what I need to do. That's for the next 5 years, I'm going to write a book. That's great. In lawyers, I'm going to win high profile cases, let's say. That's how I'm going to come QC or get whatever professional recognition. I just think that we probably want to pause every now and again, and this is probably something that I am as guilty of as the next person of not doing, and ask ourselves what we really want to accomplish. Because if our goal isn't simply to become a professor, or isn't simply to become a recognized barrister, but is to, for example, improve the situation of minorities, then the metrics of success within our professions may not match up to the metrics of success for our overall goal. And it's very easy to get sucked into those professional metrics. And so every now and again, revisiting and asking yourself kind of that big and difficult question, ideally when you have a chance to take a bit of time off and, have a bit of a break so that the demands of daily life aren't, impinging upon your thinking so much. But, asking yourself why you're really doing this, and being willing, because of that, and as a result of that, to set your own goals and to recognize, well, okay, this may mean that I'm not going to be as successful as an academic or practitioner, but I think this is the way to improve, for example, the situation of minorities. And if I can contribute to that, then that will be what success looks like. So, in a nutshell, my advice is, and this is probably advice, life advice generally, don't let other people and other groups of people, or even your professional community, define what success looks like to you. Be more active in figuring out what that looks like to you and pursuing that particular goal.
Thank you very much for your insightful remarks, and thank you for sharing your observation and thoughts with us today. It was very wonderful to have you today. Stay safe. We'll see you soon again. Goodbye. God bless you.
Absolutely. Wonderful to talk to you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.